Welcome everybody to the Adelaide.net user group, our April meeting. My name's David Gardner and it's great to have you with us. Thanks for those that have joined, and anticipate might be a few more people joining us along the way. Looking forward to having John with us this evening. We do thank our sponsors, so Simon and Christine from Encode Talent. I think Simon's on the call tonight. If you're looking to get some good staff to join you, or if you're looking for somewhere new to work, have a chat with Simon. He'd love to talk to you. We also thank Taptu, a local development company that we appreciate their support of the group as well. And have a chat to them if you have got some projects that you'd like to work with them on. We had some of the people from Taptu join us a couple of months ago. So yeah, great guys. So we, the Adelaide.net user group, we meet once a month. We're on Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn and on Meetup as well. And appreciate you spreading the word about what we're doing. Next month, haven't actually got a speaker booked in yet, so if you'd always wanted to present to the group, then this could be your chance. Do get in touch. Otherwise, hopefully we'll lock somebody in the next week or two and let you know. Don't forget the Slack. If you're not involved already, the Heaps Good Dev Slack for catching up with the other developers in Adelaide and South Australia. Some great conversations been happening there, not just .NET, but front end and other languages. Some really good discussions. And also there is the jobs channel as well for people to advertise for positions available, and also people looking for work. We have our own YouTube channel, and we'd like to get recordings of our talks published up there. We've just had some new ones. One just went up early today, in fact, and so we've got some new content up there from some of our talks from earlier this year. And thank you for those subscribing. I have to update that screenshot. We're now over 100 subscribers, so that means I get to rename the channel. So I can, but I haven't actually done it yet because I'm going, oh, what do I want to call it? But yes, so that's good. So do subscribe if you haven't done already. And just a quick plug for the new Breakpoint. Sort of every few weeks, a new episode comes out on Twitter, and you never know who you're going to see on New Breakpoint. That's it from me. Do get in touch if you would like to speak or just help out in any way with the group. I guess, yeah, last month I thought we'd be back in person this month, but that didn't turn out to be the case. I think we're just going to sort of take it month by month, essentially, just to see how things are going and see how people are feeling about getting back in person. Hopefully it won't be too long, but I guess we'll take a cautious approach. But things do seem to be opening up again. Okay, so quick what's news, what's been happening. So we've got a new version of VS Code that came out, 1.66.2. I think the .2 just came out overnight. So it's the March 2022 release. I guess the big change there is this local history feature. So even if you don't have version control set up, like you haven't got around to setting up your local Git repo, VS Code is now able to save local and sort of track local changes, even if you haven't got that set up outside of VS Code. So yeah, nice feature there. I've seen some people benefit from that already. They'd accidentally lost some stuff, but were able to get it back by using that feature. There's also being able to filter in the settings page just to see what settings relate to a particular language, like say C# or CSS, that kind of thing. Being able to search in the terminal window. Some more improvements like with JavaScript. When you're debugging, you can look at the profile of the heap. And some other stuff around the VS Code for the web. So I think that's code.dev, I think, from memory, and some improvements in documentation. If you're into the R language, then I think there's some more stuff on that now too. Visual Studio 2019, there was a minor update for that. 16.11.12 came out overnight, sort of patch Tuesday yesterday, so Wednesday for us, the updates come out. So just some minor security and bug fixes for that. Visual Studio 2022, again 17.14, and that just had some security and bug fixes. And 2022 17.2 Preview 3 also came out overnight. That's got some new improvements in the installer, particularly if you're on a sort of enterprise domain network when using group policy. There's been some fixes for that. There's a new global search feature they've added. They've got better support for line staging with the Git tooling in VS, and apparently there's a faster code coverage tool in the test tools as well. For .NET, there were updates for .NET 6, 5 and Core 3.1 that came out. There was a .NET 7 Preview 2 that came out a few weeks ago. I believe those were all just sort of stability and non-security updates for those. I did see a note on the page here saying that for .NET, Ubuntu 22.04 support is going to be coming in May. So if you're wanting to run .NET on Ubuntu 22, so I guess the release that's coming out this year, then support for that is coming next month, which is good news. Just a reminder about the 30 Days to Learn promotion. If you want to take one of those learning paths and get a discount on a certification exam, just jump to that URL or that QR code. With that, I'm going to hand over to John, who's joining us from hopefully sunny Brisbane. I think they've had their fair share of rain up there. But no, it's great to have John with us. John, I almost met John at NDC Melbourne a few years ago. I think I might have seen him across the room, but didn't quite get to have a conversation. So it's great to have him joining us this evening, and looking forward to him sharing with us. So I'll hand over to you, John. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been some time since I've been in a .NET user group. I used to run the Melbourne one some time ago, I think 5 or 6 years ago. It's always good to meet the local mob. If you were in person, I would have made an honest attempt to get down to Adelaide and meet all of you. But in the absence of that, I guess this won't have to do. Yes, so greetings, everyone. It's a bit of an interesting little project that I've been working on on the side for the last couple of years, and I'll hopefully get a chance to share some of this with you. So let me start by sharing the screen, and can everybody see the PowerPoint presentation? I guess you can. Okay. So what I'll do is I'll move on. Now, so the primary problem is this, right? Like when you start with a .NET application, trying to get it into AKS is non-trivial. I was part of the quantum computing team at Microsoft, and one of the things I was working on over there was to build a large data warehouse of something that would store the results of experiments that the physicists were running in various parts of the world. And so we had to build a kind of free-form database. We landed up building something on Orleans, and we needed a place to host the Orleans app, and it was between AKS and Service Fabric. And I tried for about 5 days to try and get the Service Fabric thing going, figured out that all the people who knew anything about Service Fabric worked in the one building, and the learning curve was too high, so I decided this new thing called Kubernetes, so let me go and take a look at it. And then I hit upon my experience of trying to get an application going. If you can't see everything that's there, that tells you the kind of stuff you need to know just to get an application up, wired up and running in AKS today, right? You start with doing development, then you figure out how to containerize the thing, figure out how to run the thing on local Kubernetes, then figure out how to get Azure involved, figure out how to put all the resources up, figure out how to wire up all the security stuff, service principals to do all of the things that you need to do, secure the thing, then write a CI/CD pipeline to get the whole thing going. And now if you're in GitHub, then you've got to basically get GitHub and Azure to talk to each other securely. And you've got to be able to support multiple deployments and multiple environments and so on and so forth. This is enormously difficult. The actual thing that you want to focus on is just that. You want to write the code and have it deployed. That's really all you want. The rest of the stuff is all stuff that you have to be intimately familiar with before you can get even the first application going. And so that's actually turning out to be the classic barrier to entry, if you want to think of it that way. So my goal was to encapsulate the learnings that I had over several years of trying to get the initial applications going and then refine that work experience to give you something that's completely .NET idiomatic and should be fairly trivial to get started. So all you want to do is do .NET new, get an application going, write some code, git commit, git push, and that should be it. You shouldn't have to do anything more than that. Now, obviously, that comes at a price, and we'll talk a little bit about what the trade-offs are, but that's what Tugboat is. We're going to basically start with kicking off the deployment to begin with, and then we'll come back and take a look at what that involves in a minute. But what I've done is I used to have this template. This is the template in question that you care about. It was installed, so I uninstalled it, and I just reinstalled a new version of the thing, or fresh, just so that I can show you that I didn't do any sleight of hand. And I'm about to create a new application. So this is just like creating a new console app with a new name. Since I'm saying many controversial things, I'm going to go ahead and say that DS9 was the best Star Trek. So we'll create the Defiant under the Starfleet organization. And we'll go into Defiant. Can everybody see the screen? Is the text big enough?
Yeah, that's all right for me.
That's
Other
good.
people. Yep.
So
good.
If you notice, so the first tool that I need to install on my local machine is .NET. Then I'm going to use Visual Studio Code, right? And this gives me a little project. I'll try and see if I can zoom in over here. I don't think I can actually zoom into that window. But it's a neat little set of folders. Oh yeah, I can indeed. What it's done is it's given me, a bunch of things over here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and change just one set of things over here. So I'm going to set this to be Starfleet as the organization that I want to just join. I'm going to deploy everything to with US2. I'm going to give myself, I'm going to put my name in there because, it's me writing some code now. And then I'm going to give myself the GitHub user ID, and that's really all I want. Now, I do happen to have a favorite subscription I own, which I'm going to use over here. And literally, this is all the configuration that I need to do. I need to provide some information about myself. And the rest of the code, if you'll just walk through it, is a traditional .NET application that's got some batteries included. Now, having said that, I will go back to this and run a self-contained Dockerized dev shell. So this is the third tool that I need installed on my local machine. I need Docker. And that's going to basically give me a dev shell with all the other stuff that I need already pre-installed. So you don't need to install AZ the CLI. You don't need to install the GitHub CLI. You don't need to install anything else. And we'll just do make hello, which tells us that if you're running this for the first time, we want to call Tugboat in it. And I'm going to do exactly that. And it's important to make sure that you provide those configurations yourself, because it's going to actually go off and do a whole bunch of stuff at this point. Now, if you'll excuse me, it's going to go and log in to Azure on my behalf, and probably is going to ask me to do some form of 2FA. And you can't see me do this, but I'm actually punching in whatever number on the screen in my phone. And it's gone off and asked me to do a GitHub login. So that's so that it can get started with interacting with GitHub on my behalf. And if it seems like I'm just waving dead chickens at the moment, just bear with me for a minute, because this does take a little bit of time to get started, and I'll go through and explain everything that's happening at the moment. So this is now trying to set up service principals and so on. Sometimes there's a race condition depending on the region that you're in, where you create a service principal and you can't access it immediately. So we'll just we'll do some remediation in a minute. So we'll go in here, and this is the code that we looked at. If you go and look at the Bootstrap target, the makefile says that we're running this project AD setup AD app. So I'll just go ahead, and I'm sorry for waving a few dead chickens at this point, but you don't need to know too much about what's happening at this point here. So it looks like this command just needs to get rerun. And that's because there's this race condition that sometimes happens. So sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Now, because I'm running inside a Docker environment, this AZ REST call will fail for security reasons. So we'll have to, again, run this independently. But those are literally the only manual steps that you'll need once you get it going. And now if you go in here and take a look at the GitHub account that I had, you would have created the defiant and created for me the whole project. And it would have run the initial GitHub CI/CD pipeline, which would have built and tested my code. So right from the get-go, we're already now a little bit ahead of what we would have done if we'd just done .NET New. So, here's a situation where we've actually built and run some tests, and then we've also built and run a Docker image that packages the code that we wrote. And so far, we haven't done anything. The next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to set up the Azure infrastructure by running this Azure infrastructure work setup. And this, to be fair, will take 10 minutes. So in the meanwhile, what I'll do is I'll switch back to the presentation and start talking about what we're actually building. So this pipeline over here is going to get triggered off. In the meanwhile, let's talk about what we're doing. So the principal idea behind this is to have a set of well understood or well-known resources put together in a nice way that supports a basic development workflow. So for example, we want to be first of all, we want to be transparent. We don't want to have any strange things like config files that you need to know how to munge or anything of the sort. You just want everything to be actually native Azure resources that can be interacted with. And there are no hidden pieces in here. So there's no real lock-in in terms of what it is that we're building. The pieces that we have, all that this Tugboat framework is doing is running the commands that you would have run manually. So, everything's started off by saying, look, we understand that developers are going to use this, so they want to have to do multiple iterations of development. We need to support that from the get-go. There needs to be basic CI/CD support right from the get-go. It needs to be secure from the get-go. We need to have HTTPS support. We need to be able to give them everything that we built and let them take it from there and build further. And it should be completely cross-platform and so on. And so fundamentally, this is what we'll end up building. So on your dev machine, you only need a handful of tools. You need Git, you need Docker, you need .NET. If you like, you can put Kubernetes on your local machine when you install Docker. A terminal and VS Code. That's literally all you need on your side. You do need a GitHub account, and the GitHub workflows automatically get built and sent out with the repo. And so we'll be using GitHub to do all of the connection to Azure and the interaction with Azure to start with. And the first stage we'll be doing is we're going to build out infrastructure. Now, when I told you that we want to be cost conscious, we expect that developers will build multiple projects. And every time you build a project, you don't want to have to build out certain resources that can be shared across multiple projects. So for example, when you build an Azure Container Registry and you're going to pay a little bit of money for that, you only need one to support all your projects. You don't need one per project. And you need a key vault, same thing. You only need one to support multiple projects. Similarly for a front door, similarly for a container registry and so on, and your log analytics workspace. And so we build a common set of these under the org. In our case, that would be Starfleet. And then for every project that we have, we build out a set of Azure resources. In our case, we build out a storage account and a Kubernetes cluster. And we set up the Kubernetes cluster to have an ingress controller that's appropriately wired up so that when you send a URL to a browser, as I'll show you in a minute, it actually routes it to the right project and the right branch. So again, to support blue-green deployments and so on, you want to be able to have multiple versions of your application running side by side so that you can deprecate older versions and you can publish new versions. And we want to do that in a very idiomatic way as far as Kubernetes is concerned. So what we have is a mechanism that basically allows you to redeploy a new branch or a new commit and be able to test it out every time you want. So in effect, you can build out one of these things for every commit if you wanted it. What I've glossed over is there's an abstraction called the environment, and you can think of this thing that I'm showing you as the dev environment. You could have a similar environment for staging and production and follow the same kind of rules. The key here is that the deployments are completely automated. So you have a secure supply chain to go from code to container registry to Kubernetes without any manual intervention. So there's zero touch inside any of these things. All you do is kick off the workflow at the one place, and it makes sure that you have the application deployed without you having to intervene in any other fashion. And this is important because if you don't get this right at the development time, it's going to become very difficult to introduce that kind of discipline and rigor into your production environments. You want whatever happens in production to actually happen at development time, and this supports that from the get-go. Let's go ahead and see what's happening with this as usual. This is wonderful. Demo gods have not been happy with me today. What I'm going to do now is, let me just restart the workflow because I have a feeling that some transient error has taken place. And in the interest of time, I'm going to switch over to the previous project that I've created, just to give you an idea of what a successful thing looks like. The demo gods really haven't been very kind. So this Azure infrastructure workflow took just one time to run. It ran in 9 minutes, and it built out the workflow. So if we can take a look at the Azure portal, we can go in here, and I'll show you. So you can see that the Starfleet Tugboat resource group has all of the shared resources that I mentioned earlier, and that's been generated and built out. And you'll find that there are multiple applications that have individual resource groups that are built in. So for example, the Yangtze was built a few minutes before the talk, and it's got the AKS Yangtze and the storage account set up. It also has the routing set up in the front door to give you a safe and secure HTTPS endpoint that you can actually hit. And that will route the messages to the right application. So let's actually just go in and look at the Yangtze here. So the next, and your development environment kind of looks like this. So the second time you come in, you don't do a tugboat in it. What you do is you follow the instructions on your handy dandy README page, and it tells you that when you do it the first time, the second time you want to do it, you just prepare the environment. And so that's what we're going to do now. And that should set up the environment for me to talk to the Yangtze cluster. Let's log in again. Pardon me. So you'll notice that there's a lot of work that's being done, and as your daily work requires, you don't really need to do, you really don't need to know much beyond what you would normally start with development with. You don't really need to know about the GitHub CLI and so on. All of that information is, all the operations are actually packaged, including this set of instructions that you will need to actually be able to interact with your AKS cluster with kubectl. Let me just go and see what the Starfleet I have a feeling there's something very wrong with this. I honestly have no idea why. Because I literally tried this 10 minutes before the, well, an hour before the demo. And you'll notice that I've actually run the build and deploy to AKS workflows twice. So you expect to actually see 2 deployments on the Yanxi side, which I will show you in a minute. And indeed, here it is. So when I do, if I want to do, if I do a make status, the kubectl namespace, it creates the green namespace, which is where you're going to do this. You'll notice that it's actually got 2 sets of pods running, and each of them has got a Git hash embedded in the name of it. So you've got 2 pods running for one deployment and 2 pods running for the other deployment. You've got the initial English load balancers set up correctly, and multiple deployments running, multiple replica sets running. And the latest one is set to be this thing. And if we go in here, we look at the Yanxi, which is actually the application being routed correctly to and being served from the kubectl pods. If you take a look at the URL, actually it has a whole ton of information in it. For example, the org, all the projects under this org will start with the same front door ID. And then every project will have its own subdirectory over here. So the defined would have come up at this point. And then every Git hash that you've deployed will show up over here. And then you can actually go off and do the URL under the application. So if you go back and look at the topology of how this is set up, in fact, what I can do now is let's make a small change to the I'm just going to make a tiny change to the index.html. We'll take a look at that. This is what I would be doing as a developer. So I've made a diff now. I'm going to add and I'm going to do a git push. And when I do a git push over here, the Yanxi automatically runs the CI/CD pipeline, which is exactly what you expect. So if I change the code and push, I expect to have a new change, and I need this to be tested. So let's wait for a few seconds to see if it passes. And then what we'll do is we'll go ahead and deploy the change to Azure. So again, what we're going to do is we'll run the workflow trigger. So this is still running because it is actually going off and building the Docker image and so on. So that many times when you do development, something will run inside Visual Studio when you hit F5, but not run when you run it on the command line, or it certainly won't run as easily if you set it up inside Docker because you expected some other dependency, or you're expecting ports to be run out, or whatever it is. This tests to make sure that the Docker was built correctly. And while doing that, it actually builds and tests your application inside the Docker image. So it ran 4 tests and passed all 4 of them. And so this is a fairly decent CI stage in the pipeline. In the meanwhile, if we go in here and take a look at this, the build and deploy to AKS is actually working. It's working in the background. This one builds the code by getting the Azure Container Registry to securely pull the latest commit. So from the point of view of the deployment process, apart from touching the green button that says deploy this or run this workflow, there's no intervention that anyone can have to contaminate the code. Literally what you see on the commit over here is the code that will get deployed. So if you give it a couple of minutes, it will deploy it to AKS and set up a new route and give us the latest commit. So we'll take a look in here and take a look at make status. And let's just see. I could actually use kubectl. I don't need to use make status if I want. I could actually do stuff with kubectl itself directly. I'll just package that. So I should, when the build works, I should actually start seeing 3 deployments, 3 services running with load balancer, 6 pods running, and I should have a route that goes out to the new URL. And that's really what we want to do. So to make this whole thing work, all we had to do was literally push and hit a green button. And we can get rid of hitting the green button by actually just automating the pipeline to run automatically. So we have a system here. This thing has succeeded. Now, when we run this, we should actually get to see 3 sets of things. And voila, so you have 6 pods, 3 services, 3 deployments, 3 replica sets, and the latest one should have this commit. So all we did was change that. So if you notice, the old one's still running. So this is your blue-green deployment right here. The old version is still running. We haven't changed it. We haven't mucked around with it. It's exactly the same code that was running before. In fact, it's the same container. It never stopped running. And now you have the newer version of it, and it's got the changes in there. And at some point, we can actually cut over the top level URL that we want to point to the actual application. In a production system, you can set that up to point to the latest Git hash, and that's actually it. That's slightly underwhelming that the demo didn't quite work in terms of creating a new new project, but that's actually what we've done. And you can actually start, you don't need to, in fact, do anything with Tugboat. You can actually start by just doing exactly what I did, which is make, just do a .NET Q and go from there. Yep, so that's it from me.
Thanks, John. I'm curious to know the people in the chat, sort of, are people using Kubernetes already, or is this something new for other people? If they are, have they experienced some of the same problems that that John sort of listed right at the start, the numerous configuration things that he's had to deal with? Feel free to unmute. We're a smaller group tonight, so be interested to hear if anyone has done Kubernetes deployments, what they would think of using this kind of system.
See what's
Yep. So
Yep.
we
Hi, David.
for it,
Hi,
Mark.
John. Sorry, someone else has jumped in.
Oh, that's all right. I was just going to ask, with the making a tamper-proof deployment pipeline, how do you separate the the permissions or whatnot, so that the infrastructure, I guess, is not modifiable by the development team? Or what's the process there for
so you dive straight
locking that down?
Did I mute myself? You dived straight into the difficult questions. Yeah, that's cool. I like that. So as it turns out, if you don't actually, when you do the Azure install CLI piece, if you don't actually try and get the admin thing, you won't even be allowed to run a kubectl command on your AKS system. It's actually pretty well locked down. So the way it works is like this. It uses OIDC, and so that's OpenID Connect for people who don't speak 4-letter acronyms. And what we do is we create a service principal on Azure and give it permissions. Give it permissions to say things like, from that GitHub repo on that branch, you're allowed to do this and nowhere else. And in effect, what happens is we land up creating a few service principals which wire up permissions so that only that service principal is allowed to, say, pull from an ACR into the AKS or push from the pipeline into the ACR. And even in terms of actually setting up all the Azure infrastructure, GitHub has permissions to do all of those things. But if you don't have your own rights on that subscription to be able to do stuff, like somebody has to do the make init piece, right? The thing that sets up the repo. They will need to have the super admin type privileges that you need. But other than that, the only privileges you need are to do git push and git push onto GitHub, and everything else requires permissions that you don't necessarily need to have to do any development. So that's one issue. The more insidious issue is what happens if you have somebody modify the GitHub pipeline to introduce a tool to actually modify stuff. And you can basically lock that down when you set up the GitHub permissions to say that you're allowed to check in code, but you can't change the workflow. And those permissions are given to you from GitHub. So you effectively lock it down in stages, and you prevent anyone having the magic key to manually enter the pipeline. Everything's done using managed identities and rotating certificates and that kind of thing. And there's just service principals that do all of the mediation work. So there's actually nobody who has, even I don't, my ID does not have the privileges to actually go in and do something unless I request those as the owner of the subscription in order to be able to do stuff. So if your average dev wants to do something, they actually can't.
Okay, great. So developers only need Git commit access, and then the infrastructure is built and managed by a separate team.
Yeah, that's exactly the point. The point is
Cool.
that you don't need that huge knowledge of that critical mass of knowledge to get started before you do anything, right? You can let somebody else who has the appropriate privileges do most of that. So let me just give you an idea of what I'm talking about over here. So if you go into, say, the Yangtze group and take a look at the AKS cluster, okay, the privileges associated with this, there's literally no one has any direct privileges on this. You really have just the service principal doing stuff and nothing else. So even if I came in here and started doing stuff, unless I had, I'm on the portal, I'm logged in as myself, right? I'm trying to access the cluster to say, hey, give me some information, and I don't have the right to do that. It's not even letting me look at, say, for example, the workloads that I need. It says, I don't have a cluster role deployment at all. It is so secure that I'm locked out. The only way I interact with it is through the service principal that's been set up when I do this. So I can interact with the AKS cluster the way I'm expected to interact with it, but not through the back door. So when I tell you that this thing is designed to basically be production ready, it is. It started with that idea that whatever should be difficult to do in production should also be difficult to do in dev.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Thanks for showing us that, John.
Yeah, does that foil your evil plan, Mark?
It does, unfortunately.
We had a comment from David White saying that he was looking at using Kubernetes as a cheaper alternative to an app service.
Look, I work for the AKS team, so really I'm biased. You really ought to use AKS. But in reality, as a developer, which is where I started with this, as an app developer, where I started with this, I found that it's very difficult to replace PaaS, right? Like, so the old version, the old style PaaS applications, they were beautiful in the sense that you focused on writing the application. You had to maybe do some things a bit differently because you knew you were running in the cloud, so you couldn't just like read your config settings from your local JSON file or whatever it is. You need to do something interesting for that, right? And if you wanted to hit the local file system, you couldn't just hit the local file system. You had to accept the fact that this was in the cloud. There might have been a way of actually interacting with it, that kind of thing, right? So PaaS was very cool because it allowed you to focus on development, but it was also a kind of locked-in kind of mechanism. There's only one way to deploy the thing. You have to download the zip file, do some stuff, push things in the right place, right-click publish, right? We don't want to do that anymore. We're in 2022, right? We want to do CI/CD, test everything as soon as it goes in, have nice, clean control of how you actually push stuff over to production and have confidence that what you're seeing in production or what you're seeing deployed is the same thing that was running on your local machine. And with the whole idea of Dockerizing your application and building the same image from the same Git hash and having it show up in Azure on AKS without you having to really do much more than like press a button. And that pressing of a button is not you interacting with the deployment process like PaaS used to be. It's literally kicking off the build, right? And you can actually automate that too. You can basically say, when a tag shows up saying deploy, press that green button for me, and it'll do that for you, right? So really you want to get to the point where you focus on the application and you don't worry so much about the infrastructure. Of course, you need to worry about the infrastructure when things like the demo doesn't quite work. So I have to kind of walk back the confidence with which I'm speaking. But for the vast majority of the demos that I've done, that piece works without having to even kick off a new build. And I have to go now and try and figure out why the authentication why it was whining about the authentication.
So Isabella commented that she hasn't used Kubernetes, but done stuff with Azure and CI/CD, and has been a bit of a learning curve. So appreciates the, I guess, the simplification of what this tool offers. So I can see.
Indeed. So
yeah.
the idea there is, look, I work for a team that probably is one of the absolute best team, has the most experience to build high-scale Kubernetes applications on Azure, right? Like that's our job. So if we can package our knowledge in a way that allows somebody else to actually just run it without having to learn all of the stuff that we've learned, or follow all of the steps that we've followed, or in fact, even just mumbling all the incantations we did, then that's a big win. The sum total of knowledge that you would need to replicate what Tugboat is doing is, you need to know all about Docker. You'd need to know about port forwarding in Docker and how to get multiple copies of a web API application running in parallel with a load balancer in between to be able to serve each other, serve requests without tromping on each other's toes, right? You need to know that. You need to know how to deploy stuff to Azure. So you'll need to know Bicep. You'll need to know, like, there's a whole ton of technologies that you'd have to basically have a working knowledge of and be proficient enough to debug. And this is before you get your first application actually serving up a response to a request. And in some sense, Tugboat turns it on its head and says, look, I've given you a batteries included thing. So the application, which I haven't really spent any time walking through, but you'll notice it's got property-based tests built in. It's got a scaffold for that. It's got scaffolding for your documentation. It's got scaffolding for static website. It's got scaffolding for Swagger file. It's got all of those things that you'll need, wiring up app insights and all the other stuff that you'll need to do to run a proper application in an Azure environment. It's a hell of a lot more than just what .NET New, Web API gives you, because that's geared towards getting you started and introducing you to as few concepts as possible. This one's saying, look, in order to get the thing actually running in the cloud, you've got a whole bunch of things you need to do. Here are all the things that I've got an opinion on. I've given you that to start with. Now you can go in, start there, and then replace whatever you don't like. And you've got yourself a different starting point that you can use. And anyone can rebuild the templates to be, their own custom templates. All you need is access to NuGet, and you can package your own templates, that are specific to your application or whatever it is, and enrich your own development environment. So that way you don't have to redo all of the learning that you had to do in the first place.
Yeah. Simon, did you have a question for John? Thought Simon did try and talk earlier.
Hello.
Yes.
Yeah,
Hey guys. Very impressive, John. I'm on the learning curve for AKS and Kubernetes as well, and I agree it's completely overwhelming how much you have to learn to get started into it. I guess my question was around Microsoft provides some best practices for setting up on AKS. So how closely does Tugboat follow that guidance? Or how easily can you get to that guidance from Tugboat if it doesn't?
So to be honest, I don't know what the guidance of the week is at this point, because everything's sort of evolving, right? What I can tell you about Tugboat is that it uses all the latest guidelines in terms of like how to set up Azure stuff, which is not covered by AKS. So you expect people to write stuff in Bicep and get that going. So it follows that. The interop between GitHub and Azure, that's the guidance there is to use OIDC and to use managed identities to do stuff. Again, that part we follow in Tugboat. That's how it's all implemented, right? In terms of actually the AKS clustering and stuff like that, a lot of what you are seeing here is actually just born out of trying to get an application to work. So there are certain guidelines that I have explicitly followed, and most of those are in areas where I don't have a deep level of expertise So I follow the guidelines that have been laid out. In terms of AKS, of course, I don't know if I violated anything that is the latest guidelines. It'd be interesting to maybe have a conversation offline about what specifically you're concerned about and what we do. And so you can take a look at it from that point of view. In terms of from what I understand, we basically reused every bit of the most emergent pieces, the most emergent features of AKS, with a view to basically simplifying deployment and simplifying security. Those are the two main concerns that I've had to battle with in terms of actually deploying out an AKS cluster. It's a good question, though.
And thank you. I appreciate it's a very complex subject as well. So yes, thank you.
Or anyone else with questions or comments for John, either in the chat or feel free to unmute as well.
I've been impugned. So does anybody know the name of another Starfleet ship?
Voyager, have you done? Or we've got Discovery in the chat.
Okay, let's do Discovery. We do need to, let me just try and see if I can let me try again. It might work, it might not. But I honestly don't know why it didn't work, to be honest. This is actually the center. Let me go in here. Oh, yeah. But those make files that are there, they actually have, you don't need to know anything about make in order to use this, but there's quite a sophisticated set of actually prepackaged technologies which I can document that simplify the use of any of these other underlying technologies. So you don't actually have to remember the incantation to mumble in Docker or the incantation to mumble on kubectl or the incantation to mumble on Azure to get something to go. So that's one of the reasons why I like using, oh, I think I've done something stupid here. Run this from inside the dev shell. So once I get the dev shell going, it's basically straightforward from there. In fact, I don't usually have make installed on my local dev box. Having make is kind of useful. Yeah. In the meanwhile, if anyone has any questions, go ahead and shout them out, because really now it's watching paint dry and trying to figure out why it's not drying the way I wanted it to.
I was going to ask,
go on,
John, about it seemed like you were building 3 times effectively, like sort of two jobs in the workflow and then the container build. Is that right?
Oh, so the CI/CD thing, right? So let me explain why that level of paranoia exists. Again, as I mentioned earlier, when you start developing, say, web applications, they encourage you to basically hit F5 and do development on Visual Studio, right? Usually that doesn't give you something that runs from the command line, because you've taken on some dependency that, you know, the Visual Studio environment is going to fix up something for you, like, you know, the order in which your configuration files are set up or something like that. Right? So I make sure that we do a command line build with .NET build and test, and then I also then do what is it? I do the, so just give me one moment. So this is beautiful. You notice I told you about a race condition the last time around that showed up. That race condition didn't show up this time. Everything just worked, except for this one thing, which it complains about because I'm running from a Linux environment inside Docker, right? And that's the only thing that you need to actually do once. Hang on here. I think I know what the issue was. The race condition last time didn't set up the service principals properly. But this time around, it was genuinely a race condition because this time around, I didn't have to redo the targets. Everything succeeded. And the service principals got created correctly. And we are good to go. We're here. And when we run this AZ-REST command, everything should just succeed, and it does. And in the meanwhile, the GitHub, let's walk through in a little bit of detail what the GitHub thing is doing. So we went through, and this is, we want the discovery, right? So there we go. And we've got code, right? And it's already got a green tick. Now what did it actually do over here? Well, let me kick off the infrastructure setup, and then we'll, so we've got another 10, 12 minutes. Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah. So let me get back to the question that you asked me, which is why are we building it twice? We're building it twice because the first time is actually, I should rename that name of that task, but it's actually doing a .NET build and test. And in this case, you're actually running all of the stuff using .NET Restore, .NET Build, the test, and just make sure that everything currently works as far as your application is concerned. But notice that we're not actually publishing the app at this point or trying to test if the published app actually works. When you build the Docker image, you have to basically publish the Docker image into the appropriate folder and make the container skinny and pass in appropriate environment variables to give you an image that can run. Now, if you do this make Docker build on your local machine and then do make Docker run on your local machine, it will actually fire up Docker on your local machine and run your application from inside of Docker. So you can actually see how it works, right? I'll show you what that looks like here. So I'm in discovery here. I'm going to do make Docker build Docker run. So this one actually builds the image, as you can see. And the purpose of doing this is that it's possible that your .NET application will run on the command line tool, but the Docker image won't run because you've got a dependency on something in your folder. Like you may have a folder structure that you're dependent on that isn't going to be in the production environment because you didn't put it into the Docker image. So in order for you to test that, you need to test that without, you can do that using the fast feedback of actually having run it on your local machine. So that's kind of what this whole thing does, is it tests to make sure that the image that you're going to actually run will work correctly on a single node, right? Now, that's not the end of the story, because the moment you actually, so let's say, for example, you grab a port and you say, okay, I'm going to respond on this port. And while doing so, I will grab something that, like a mutex from the cloud. So maybe I grab a blobs key or something like that. Then when 3 of these run in parallel, only one of them will actually run, because it won't be in a position to actually run. Now I can't run this because I can run it from in here actually. The port is already allocated. So we have a couple of things. They've got like multiple projects running, and that's part of the main problem over here. But in effect, building both the image and building the project give you confidence that the thing's actually going to run the way you expect it to run in the cloud. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. So then once you've got past that check, then there's from what I can see, then there was that final.
No. So it's all levels of checking, right? So the first bit is checking to make sure that your application runs on the command line. So the fact that it runs in F5 and passes all your tests in Visual Studio doesn't really give you any confidence that the stuff that's going to run on the cloud is going to work correctly, right? So you got to make sure that the command line piece works. This one makes sure that you've got everything that you've needed from your local environment packaged into a sterile location, into a sterile container, and that's all that's running. So there's no dependency that's hidden on your local machine. There's no environment variable that you're picking up by mistake and running that your application depends on. So if you're running it from within Docker, then you're running it from this sort of sterile environment, and you have some confidence that the application runs, but only one of them is being tested at this point, only one instance. Once you get to the point where they're actually trying to deploy, you've got multiple instances that are running concurrently. And that's yet another problem that you have to worry about, because if you've taken some dependency on exactly one of these things being there in order to process the request, then we have a problem. So these two give you confidence that at the end of the day, the image that you push out is going to work correctly. But when you actually deploy to AKS, we never deploy a single pod. We always deploy 2 copies to make sure that it's ready to scale. So you can start with a development environment that starts with 2 pods, and then you can say, okay, in production, give me 20 of these, right? And scale it, auto scale it up and down by yourself. And you can set all that up automatically. So those are the levels of sort of incremental confidence that you have as you go along. So you'll notice that the infrastructure setups actually built the org resources and the proj resources as before. These two have been, they didn't succeed the last time around because of that authentication issue. And this build cluster thing will take another 4 minutes to do. And what it's actually doing is building out the AKS cluster. So if you go up to portal and start looking, you'll find that there's a whole new resource group under the Starfleet org that's sharing the same resources. If I go in here and start looking at Starfleet, it'll tell you that I've got the Yangtze and the Discovery are now basically being built. And in the Discovery thing, the AKS Discovery is now currently being built out. And when this is done, you'll have the cluster and then the role assignments associated with actually opening up access to those clusters to the various different orgs. So for example, there's a role assignment that opens it up to the container registry saying this cluster is allowed to pull information from the container registry. And there's another one that basically says the GitHub thing can push stuff into the container registry, and the GitHub thing can actually do a deployment onto AKS. And if you want to monitor and interact with AKS, here's a service principal that does that. So all of those the AD role propagation stuff that's in there is actually, and of course, there's a whole bunch of front door routes that are being created and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of work that's actually happening at this point, which just happens in the background. It used to be, before this talk, this is actually the first time I'm actually showing this running from the CI/CD from GitHub. Up until about a week ago, all of these operations were conducted on your local machine interacting with Azure. And so you had like more privileges that were needed to get things started up. And what I've done is packaged it in such a way that if we safely pushed into GitHub, and GitHub has the only way, it has the only access to actually do all of these things. So improve the security of the thing in the last couple of days, really what it is. So this will shortly turn green, actually. There we go. This is now green. And we have the Azure infrastructure has been now set up. And in fact, I can blindly go in now and say, please deploy whatever you have onto AKS so that we have an application that we can take a look at. And in the meanwhile, we'll go in here and start connecting to Tugboat. Oh wait, I already did that. Which would have been false because the cluster wouldn't have been ready, so we wouldn't have had the privileges to go and do what we needed to do. At the moment, in fact, I must have timed it just after the cluster was created. So you can see that the green namespace hasn't been created the first time around. Well, now that I've done a deployment, it should have actually pushed out the green namespace. Well, this one's building it. And this one says, look, I know that I built a local Docker image, but I don't trust GitHub, right? I don't trust the build pipeline on GitHub. This one sucks the code directly from the Git head into the Azure Container Registry. So there is no way to inject something into the build pipeline to contaminate the code, because the thing that's doing the building is in Azure. Right?
Well, that's running it. Also, that's a question I was going to ask, but David's asked as well. Is the Tugboat, is it available yet? Is it something we can get?
It's what I'm doing with you right now. It's you can basically go to NuGet, and cheekily, it is the West Island. I mean, my team is in New Zealand, so we are the West Island. And all you have to do is install this, run this command, and then do the .NET New the way I said. Now that last bit of documentation, I'll publish. In fact, why don't we do that right now? Seeing that it's quite auspicious. I'll go ahead and.
Wow. You need a drum roll or sound effect.
Well, considering there was the sound of the crashing demo a few minutes ago, I think that would have done just well. Here you go. It's public. So if you just go down to Tugboat, you'll get all the instructions you need. So do a .NET New install, .NET New .NET Web API, and it'll create you a C# or an F# program. It'll give you what you need. You run the dev shell, and then just say make hello and follow the instructions. And when you when you actually do this, you'll get your own README file, which I showed you over here. So in the Starfleet Discovery thing, there's the README file at this point. And it has all of the information that you need. It'll tell you how to run for the first run, what the CI pipeline is, how to set up the infrastructure, deploy it, how to connect to the cluster the first time and every time after that, and then just do make status. And here's what a dev cycle looks like. Come into a new terminal, run the dev shell, make Tugboat prepare environment, fire up code, make .NET all, do whatever you want to do locally, git commit, git push, and then press the button. And here you go. It's actually available. And if you want to raise a bug, you now have the ability to create an issue on the Tugboat repo.
That's very cool.
Yeah, but this thing has been around for some time. It's just not been public. Mostly up until 22, all the creation of the Azure resources was being done locally. So, okay, so let's take a look in here and see what happened. Build and deploy to AKS is green. It worked, right? So if we go in here, it says that the landing page is such and such. So let's go into the landing page. And it says it's just built out the Azure front door. So you'll end up with this, please wait for a few minutes. It takes about 4 or 5 minutes for that to check out. If I do a make status, I should get the green. I should get the green namespace. The green namespace is up. The 2 pods are running. The service is up. The load balancer is up. Deployment replica set, everything is up. And we should be in a position to actually, so you'll see that this thing changes shape every so often while the Azure front door routing is set up and so on. You'll eventually get a, hey, this is a bad address and everything. But in about 3 minutes, this link will actually point to Starfleet's discovery. So if you notice, this bit hasn't changed. This front door is still the same front door as it was before. And so this becomes the Yangtze and then the GitHub hash ID of the thing that you want. And that'll be where we are at the moment. There we go. So yeah, so look, no hands, right? Like it actually works. So I could now do a git push on this and get myself a new one.
Cool.
So thanks to your generosity, I was able to basically give you a full-blown second demo.
Yeah. That's great stuff. Okay, last call for questions or comments from the floor. If not.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you all very much for the opportunity to have a conversation. Please feel free to use it. Feel free to raise issues, tell your friends, play with AKS and see how this makes it easy to take like the web applications and like stick it in on the cloud.
Yeah, no, I think it looks like a really interesting tool. I mean, to be honest, I've never sort of used Kubernetes myself. It's always seemed a bit of a scary thing, but this seems to make it look a little bit more approachable. So I think that's really helpful. So yeah, and some good comments from other people as well. Thank you, John. I appreciate your time and sharing with us. And yes, we feel honoured to see the public release of the GitHub repo as well. So yeah, we'll say thank you to you and to everyone else for joining us tonight. And we'll hope to see everybody again next month. Thank you.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
See you, John.